The first thing Cotter noticed was the boots on the oldest boy. They were a woman's boots, laced with what looked like sewing thread, and at least 2 sizes too big. The boy had stuffed something into the toes to keep them from slipping, rags or paper or whatever he had found along the road, and he walked with the careful, flat-footed gait of a person who has learned to keep borrowed things from falling apart beneath him. That alone told Cotter most of what he needed to know. They came up the Gallatin Road in the late amber light of an October afternoon in 1882, 4 of them, moving in a loose column through the dust. A young woman walked in front, setting a pace that was neither fast nor slow, the pace of someone who has learned to measure what her body can give across a day and refused to spend it all before noon. Behind her came 3 boys, spaced along the road like fence posts marking a property line, each one smaller than the last. The oldest was maybe 13, tall for his age and making himself taller with every step, carrying a canvas sack over one shoulder that pulled him slightly to the left, but which he had not once shifted to the other side, because the other side was closest to the road and he had placed himself between the road and his brothers. Cotter noticed that. It was the kind of thing only someone who had done the same would notice. The middle boy was 8 or 9, sandy-haired, with a scab across one knee, and the watchfulness of a child who has been surprised by the world too many times to trust it completely. He walked with his hands open at his sides, not in fists, not relaxed, just open. Ready. The youngest was 5 at most, and he was being carried. The woman had him on her left hip, settled there with the unconscious balance of someone who has carried this weight across miles and days and possibly weeks. Her right hand held a bundle wrapped in what had once been a wool blanket and tied with cord at both ends. She had no wagon, no horse, no companion beyond the 3 boys, and about her face she wore the expression of a person who has made a decision somewhere behind her on the road and will not unmake it, regardless of what she finds ahead. Cotter watched them from the corral fence where he had been sitting with a cold cup of coffee for the better part of an hour, staring at the south meadow and doing the mathematics he did every morning now. The mathematics of a ranch that needed 4 hands and had 2. The mathematics of hay that would not cut itself and fence line that would not mend itself, and a winter coming on like a train with no intention of slowing down. He was 41 years old. His hands looked like they had been carved from the same hardwood as the posts he set with them, and the Montana wind had spent 20 years working on his face, the way a river works on stone, taking what was soft and leaving what was not. He was not a cruel man, though he knew people in the valley thought he might be. He had simply become a man who did not speak when he had nothing to say, and silence in a big man is almost always mistaken for something harder than it is. The woman reached the gate and stopped. She set the youngest boy down. He made a small sound of protest that she answered by placing one hand on the top of his head. Gently, the way you touch a thing to tell it that you are still here. The boy leaned against her leg and closed his eyes again, trusting her to be the structure that held him up. She looked at the ranch. The barn, solid and large, built by someone who had known what he was doing, but showing the slow decline of a place maintained by fewer hands than it required. The house, well made, with 2 stone chimneys, but only one of them trailing smoke. The corral, where 3 of his horses stood with the heavy patience of animals that had not been properly worked in weeks. The pasture beyond, where maybe 40 head of cattle grazed in grass that was still good, but would not be good for long without rotation. She saw all of it. And then she looked at Cotter with the expression of a person deciding whether this is a place where truth will be accepted. The oldest boy moved up beside her. The middle boy hung back 3 paces, watching Cotter with those 2 careful eyes. The youngest swayed against her leg like a small tree in a mild wind. Cotter set his cup on the fence post. He did not climb down. He had learned years ago that the way you receive a stranger in the first 10 seconds writes the terms for everything that follows, and he had not yet decided what terms he wanted. Then the canvas sack on the oldest boy's shoulder moved. Something inside it shifted, and let out a small, muffled sound. Warm. Alive. And whatever Cotter Vane had been planning to say rearranged itself entirely before it reached his mouth. The Harrow Creek Ranch sat in a wide bend of the Gallatin River, where the valley floor opened up between two ridgelines, and the mountains stood behind everything like a thought nobody had finished. 640 acres of river bottom and mountain grass and timber that had taken 20 years to build into something, and was now taking considerably less time to come apart. Cotter Vane had not meant to build it alone. He had come to this land in 1862 with his wife Bessa, and a deed that said they owned something that did not yet exist, except as possibility and grass and a creek that ran cold and clear through the center of everything. They had built the house together, him and Bessa. 2 rooms the first year, then 4, then the second chimney, when the first winter taught them that 1 fireplace was a hope, and 2 was a plan. They had run cattle and bred horses, and argued about fencing and laughed at the colts in the spring pasture, and slowly, season by season, turned a piece of paper into a life. Bessa had been the kind of woman who could look at a full-born crooked-legged in March and tell you by the way it held its head whether it would straighten by summer. She had hands that could gentle a horse or dress a wound or lay a course of stone with the same calm certainty. And she had wanted children the way the valley wanted rain, not desperately, but deeply, in the way of someone who understood that some things are the whole point of everything else. It had taken them 11 years. 11 years of hope and prayer, and 2 losses that Cotter still could not think about directly, but only approach from the side, the way you approach a fire that is too hot to stand in front of. And then, in the autumn of 1873, Bessa had told him it was happening again. They had both been afraid to want it, and then they had wanted it anyway because that is what people do. She died in February of 1874. The child, a boy, lived 4 hours. Cotter buried them together on the ridge above the house where the morning sun came first and the evening light stayed longest. He built the marker himself from stone he pulled from the creek bed, and then he had gone back to work, because the cattle did not grieve and the horses did not mourn, and winter was still winter, regardless of what it had taken. The years since then had turned him into something the valley did not quite understand. A man who did not go to town dances or church socials. A man who spoke to his neighbors in sentences of 6 words or fewer. They were not wrong about the silence. They were wrong about the reason. He had hired hands twice. The first, a man named Pruitt, who vanished in the night with a bridle that had been Bessa's and a pair of silver spurs Cotter had made himself. The second, 2 brothers from Helena, who lasted 1 winter and told him they would rather work a mine than spend another season on a ranch where the boss never spoke. Now it was 1882, and the arithmetic was final. His right shoulder would not lift above his ear without a sound like dry wood breaking. His left knee predicted weather more accurately than any almanac. He had 40 head of cattle, and 12 horses, and 640 acres, and the plain truth was that a ranch this size needed a crew, and he had himself. The south fence had been leaning since August. The east pasture had not been rotated since spring. The barn roof had a soft spot that would become a hole before January, and the second chimney had not been lit since the winter Bessa died, because the room it heated was closed and would remain closed because Cotter Vane could face most things in this life, but he could not face that room. He knew what the valley said, that he should sell, that a man alone on 640 acres was not ranching, but performing a slow act of stubbornness dressed up as purpose. They were probably right. But he had built that second chimney with Bessa. He had set every stone. And selling this land would be the same as saying that what they had built together could be converted to a number and handed to a stranger, and that would be the end of it. So he sat on the corral fence every morning with his cold coffee, and he did his arithmetic, and he went to work, and he kept going in the way that a river keeps going, not because it has decided to, but because it does not know how to stop. And now there was a woman at his gate, with 3 boys and no horse, and nowhere to go. And the canvas sack was moving. Cotter climbed down from the fence. He took his time about it, not to make them wait, but because he had learned that hurry was a kind of promise, and he was not yet sure what he was willing to promise. He walked to the gate. Up close, the woman was younger than he had thought. 20, maybe 21. She had dark hair pulled back tight, and her face had a thinness that does not come from build, but from weeks of making sure other people eat first. There were circles under her eyes that looked less like tiredness and more like permanence, but her eyes were clear, brown and clear, and looking at him without apology, without the performance of need that he had seen on the faces of drifters and grifters who had polished their hard luck stories to a shine. She was not performing. She was simply standing there with whatever she had, which was very little, and whatever she was, which he had not yet decided. "Mr. Vane," she said. It was not a question. She had asked someone his name before she came. That meant she had planned this, and planning meant she was not running blind. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "My name is Marin Dunhill. These are my brothers. Orrin is 13. She put her hand on the oldest boy's shoulder. "Win is 8. The sandy-haired boy met Cotter's eyes and held them for 1 full second, which at 8 years old, in the presence of a silent stranger, is a considerable act of courage, and Lark is 5. The smallest boy was awake now, peering out from behind Marin's leg with the solemn, unblinking stare of a child who is still young enough to look at the world without pretending he is not afraid of it. Cotter looked at each of them in turn, then he looked back at Marin. "What's in the sack?" he asked. It was not the question she had been expecting. The oldest boy, Orrin, adjusted the sack and looked at Marin with the wordless question of a boy who has learned to check before he acts. She nodded. Orrin opened the top of the sack, carefully. Inside, nested in a wad of torn cloth and dry grass, was a dog. A pup, maybe 10 weeks old, brown and white, with one ear that stood up and one that did not, and ribs visible beneath its fur like fingers under a bedsheet. "We found him 2 days back," Orrin said. His voice had the cracked quality of something caught between childhood and whatever comes after. "Somebody left him by the road. He was tied to a fence post with no water." The boy's jaw tightened on the last 2 words, and Cotter saw something in the tightening that he recognized, the specific anger of someone who understands abandonment because he has tasted it himself. "He's thin," Cotter said. "He'll fill out," Orrin said, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence, and everything to do with will. "Mr. Vane," Marin said, "I will be direct with you, because I have walked 9 days to get here, and I do not have the energy to be otherwise." She paused, not for drama, but to arrange her words the way a person arranges tools before starting a job. "I was told in Bozeman that you run this ranch alone and that it is too much for one man. I can see they were right. Your East Corral gate is hanging on one hinge. Your hay barn is short by at least 15 cuttings for the winter you are about to have, and your horses have not been worked in weeks. I can tell by the way that Bay is standing, weight on 3 legs, favoring the right front. That is not an injury. That is a horse who is bored and stiff and has not been ridden enough to keep himself sound." Cotter said nothing. She was right about the bay. "I know horses," Marin said. "My father bred them. I can break, train, shoe, and doctor. I know cattle well enough. I know hay and fencing and how to keep a root cellar through a Montana winter." She drew a breath. "There are 4 of us. I know that is a lot to ask. But Orrin works like a man and does not complain. Win is old enough to carry water and feed stock and keep a fire, and Lark stays where I put him and does not wander." She looked at Cotter. I am not asking for charity. I am not asking for wages. I'm asking for a roof and meals and a place where my brothers can sleep without me sitting up all night to make sure nothing comes through the door." Cotter looked at her. He looked at the three boys. He thought about every single thing she had named that was true, and that he had been pretending was not as bad as it was. Then he thought about the last two people he had let onto this property, and the bridle and the spurs and the empty house, and the years of silence, and the door at the end of the hall that he could not open. The word no began to form. It formed the way it always formed, rising from somewhere deep and familiar, the place where experience had stacked itself into a wall and called it wisdom. And that was when the sound came, from the south pasture, not from the cattle. From the horses, a sound that Cotter Vane had heard only 3 times in 20 years, and each time it had meant the same thing. Something was wrong with the herd. The sound came again, higher this time, sharper, cutting through the October air like a blade through cloth. This was a scream. A horse in panic, in pain, or in both. And it was coming from the south pasture where the fence had been leaning since August, and where Cotter had been meaning to run new wire for 6 weeks, and had not because there was only one of him and the days were only so long. He turned toward the sound, and his body told him 3 things at once. His shoulder told him it would not forgive him for what he was about to ask it to do. His knee told him the same. And his gut told him that whatever was happening in that pasture was happening now and would not wait for a man whose body had started writing letters of resignation that his mind refused to read. He looked at Marin. "Stay here," he said, already moving. "Don't touch anything." He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way a man says a thing when he has no time to be polite. But even as the words left him, he could feel the weight of everything they carried. Every stranger who had stood at this gate and said the right things and done the wrong ones. Every door he had opened and then closed, gently at first, then firmly, then finally with the silence that is louder than any slam. "Stay here. Don't touch anything." The words meant more than the words, and Marin Dunhill heard what they meant. She heard the no beneath the instruction, the wall behind the caution. The horse screamed again. Cotter started toward the south pasture at the best pace his body would allow, which was considerably less than the situation demanded. He could see them now through the gap in the tree line. 3 horses bunched at the far end, agitated, circling, and 1 horse down. Not fully down, but caught, tangled in something near the fence line, thrashing in the way that a caught animal thrashes when its strength is the very thing making its situation worse. Wire. The leaning fence had finally given up, and his best mare, a sorrel named Juniper who had been Bess's favorite horse's last foal, had walked into it and panicked and was now wrapped in 3 strands of barbed wire that were tightening with every movement she made. Cotter knew what barbed wire did to a horse that fought it. A panicking horse could sever a tendon in seconds, could open an artery in less. He was 200 yards away and his knee was already failing. He was not going to get there in time. She came past him so quietly that he did not hear her until she was already 10 strides ahead, moving fast but controlled. The way water moves through a channel it knows, finding the fastest line without wasting itself on turbulence. Her coat was off. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. And she was carrying the one thing she had taken from her bundle, in the 3 seconds between Cotter saying "Stay here," and the mare screaming a 3rd time, a farrier's knife, short-handled, curved blade, worn to a polish that only comes from years of daily use. She held it low against her forearm, edge turned inward, the way a person holds a tool they have carried so long it has become part of the hand. "Parn," she said without turning her head. Not a shout, just her voice pitched to carry. "Pliers from the fence post. Red handle. You saw them when we came up the road." The boy was already moving. "Win. Take Lark to the porch. Sit him down. Stay with him. Do not come to the pasture." The middle boy did not argue. He took his youngest brother's hand with the practiced efficiency of a child who has received this kind of instruction before. in other emergencies, in other places, and he walked Lark toward the house without looking back. Cotter stopped. He stopped not because he chose to, but because something in the way she moved made him understand that his presence between her and that horse was not help. It was an obstacle. Maren Dunhill was not moving like a person in panic. She slowed as she approached the fence line. 30 yards from the mare, she dropped from a walk to something that was barely movement at all. A drift, a settling. Her shoulders came down. Her hands opened at her sides. Even her breathing changed, becoming slower, longer part of the rhythm of the grass and the wind and the late October light. Juniper saw her coming. The mare's eyes were wide and white-rimmed. Her nostrils flared, her body trembling with the urgent frequency of an animal that has exhausted its first wave of panic and is gathering itself for a second. The wire was around both front legs and across her chest, and there was blood on her left foreleg, where she had already cut herself against a barb. Not deep, not yet, but another lunge would change that. Maren stopped. 15 feet from the horse. She stood still. And she began to talk. Not words that Cotter could hear from where he stood. Something lower, something that lived in the register between speech and silence, a sound that was less about meaning and more about presence, about saying, without language, I am here. I am not the thing that is hurting you. I am the thing that is going to make it stop. The mare's ears moved, one forward, one back, then both forward, locked onto the woman standing perfectly still in the grass, with nothing in her face but calm. Juniper stopped trembling. It took her 11 minutes. Cotter knew, because he counted, standing at the pasture fence with his hands on the top rail and his heart doing something it had forgotten how to do, which was hoping for something he could not control. She moved to the horse in increments so small they barely registered as movement, her hand extending, not reaching, just present, offering itself the way you offer a thing to someone who has every reason not to take it. And the mare, against every instinct that 20 million years of prey evolution had built into her blood, let her come. Maren touched Juniper's neck, one hand, flat, barely there. Something unwound in the animal's body, some coiled spring of terror, and it released, not all at once, but enough. Then she went to work. The farrier's knife moved through the first strand of wire like it was cutting thread. She worked from the chest down, left hand holding the wire taut enough to cut but not enough to shift it against the skin, right hand drawing the blade through with a precision that came from somewhere beyond practice. She talked the entire time. That same low, continuous sound, and the mare stood still for her, not frozen with fear. Still, the way an animal is still, when it has decided to trust, which is a different thing entirely from an animal that has decided to surrender. Orrin arrived with the pliers. He walked the last 20 yards at the same measured pace his sister had used, and he came around to the offside and waited without speaking until Maren glanced at him and nodded. Then he began working the lower strand free, with hands that knew what they were doing, hands that had done this before, somewhere, sometime, on another horse, on another piece of failed fence, in another life. Cotter watched. He watched the way Maren's hands moved and the way the horse responded to them, and something shifted inside his chest that he had not given permission to shift, because he had seen this before. Not this exact thing, but this quality, this gift that some people carry in their hands without knowing it, is rare. The ability to walk into an animal's fear and take it apart strand by strand. Bessa had it. Bessa, who could put her hand on a colicky foal's belly at 2 a.m, and the foal would go quiet. Bessa, who could walk into a stall with a horse that had gone barn sour and mean and walk out an hour later with the horse following her like a dog. He had not seen that quality in another person since. He had begun to believe it had been buried on the ridge and would not come again. The last wire came free. Maren straightened up and stepped back and let the mare move, which Juniper did, taking 2 tentative steps forward, then stopping to blow through her nostrils with the long, shuddering exhale of an animal releasing something it has been holding in its whole body. Maren knelt beside the left foreleg. She examined the cuts, feeling for depth, for heat, for the subtle wrongness. That means a wound is worse than it looks. Not deep, she said, but she needs them cleaned and dressed before they set. Is there a kit in the barn? She was asking Oren, but the question was for Cotter. She was letting him decide whether to answer, whether to remain on his side of the fence or come across. Cotter heard himself speak before the wall had time to close. Inside the barn door, shelf on the right, tin box with a blue lid. Oren went for it at a run. Maren stayed with the horse, while the other 3 drifted cautiously back across the pasture. Oren returned, and Maren cleaned the wounds and dressed them with a poultice, mixed from what was in the tin and dried yarrow from her own bundle. She wrapped the foreleg with a strip of clean cloth torn from something in her pack, something that might have been the last good piece of fabric she owned. She tore it without hesitation, the way a person gives up a thing that matters less than the thing it is being given, for she checked the mare's gait, walking beside her, watching each step. Then she walked back to where Cotter was standing. She had wire scratches on both forearms and blood on her right hand that was not hers, and an expression that was not pride, not performance. Simply the expression of someone who has done the thing that needed doing and is now ready for whatever comes next. The wraps should come off in 2 days and go back on fresh. She should be stall rested for a week. And your fence wire is 1864 stock. It needs replacing before you lose an animal that you cannot save. Cotter looked at Juniper drinking calmly at the trough. He looked at Oren standing beside the mare with the canvas sack still on his back. He looked at the porch where Wynne sat with Lark exactly where Maren had told them to be. He looked at all of it. Cotter Vane opened his mouth, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the word that came out was not the one the wall had chosen. There's a room at the back of the house, he said. It has 2 beds. The boys can take those. There's a cot in the storeroom off the kitchen that folds out. It is not much. He paused. I put food on the table at 6. If you are late, it gets cold. Maren Dunhill looked at him. She did not smile, but something moved behind her eyes, something that had been held tight for a very long time and was now allowed to loosen by exactly 1 degree. Last night was an open field outside of Bozeman, she said. What you are offering sounds like the finest room in the territory. From the porch, Lark's voice carried across the yard, small and clear in the October air. Wynne, the man said supper. Wynne looked at his brother. I heard him. Is it 6 yet? Cotter Vane turned toward the house so that nobody would see his face do the thing it was doing, which was something his muscles had almost forgotten how to perform. It was not yet 6, but it was close enough. In the weeks that followed, the Harrow Creek Ranch began to remember what it was supposed to sound like. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way a frozen creek thaws, not in a single dramatic crack, but in small surrenders, one section of ice giving way, and then another, until one morning you look out and the water is moving and you cannot say exactly when it started. Maren was the first sound. She was up before dawn every morning, and on the second day Cotter came out of the house in the dark and found the horses already fed and watered, and the barn swept, and the milk pail sitting on the porch rail with a cloth over it still warm. He stood there looking at it for a long moment, the way a man looks at something that has appeared in a place where nothing has appeared for years. She worked without being told. She did not ask what needed doing. She saw it. The east gate was rehung by the end of the first week. The hay barn gained 4 cuttings in the first 10 days, because Maren and Oren worked the north meadow from sunup to noon, and stacked the bales with a precision that spoke of practice and necessity. She was extraordinary with the horses. She worked all 12 of them, not just exercising but reading them, learning each animal's weight and rhythm and temperament the way a musician learns an instrument, not by studying it but by playing it, until the playing becomes a conversation. Juniper's legs healed clean. By the 4th week, the mare was following Marin around the corral like a dog. Cotter watched this from the barn door one morning and had to turn away because the thing it made him feel was too close to the thing he had spent all those years building a wall against. The boys were the other sounds. Aaron worked like a man twice his age and complained like a man half his, which is to say, not at all. He took to the cattle with a seriousness that was almost startling in a 13-year-old, walking the fence line each morning, noting every weakness, every lean. He carried a journal, a battered thing with a cover made from an old feed sack, and he wrote things in it each evening after supper. Cotter saw him writing one night and asked what he was recording. "The land," Orrin said. "What it does and where it does it, where the water collects after rain, where the grass comes in thick and where it goes thin, which fence posts are sound and which ones are going soft." He looked up. "You cannot fix a place if you do not know it, and you cannot know it if you do not write it down." Cotter said nothing, but he went to bed that night thinking about the boy's words in a way that kept him awake longer than he would have liked. Wynne was the quiet engine. 8 years old and self-appointed keeper of the root cellar, the firewood supply, and the water buckets. He stacked wood with mathematical precision. He learned to start the kitchen fire on his 3rd try, and after that, it was his job and he performed it with the grave dedication of a boy who has discovered that being useful is the same thing as being safe. And Lark was 5 years old, and he had the gift of small children who have lived through difficult things, which is the gift of finding wonder in ordinary moments with an intensity that makes the people around them remember that ordinary moments are not ordinary at all. He named the chickens, all 9 of them. He sat on the porch step each morning and narrated the ranch's activities to the pup, whom he had named Bridge. "That one is leaning," he told Bridge one morning, pointing at the south corral. "Orrin says it needs replacing, but I think it is just tired." Cotter, passing behind him with a feed bucket, heard this and felt something loosen behind his ribs that he did not have a name for. Bridge filled out the way Orrin had promised he would, though the one ear still would not stand and probably never would. The ranch absorbed him without ceremony, as though he had always been there. Supper was at 6. Always. In the 1st week, the table held the careful silence of strangers. But by the 2nd week, Orrin had begun asking questions about the land, the water table, which pastures grew thick in wet years. Cotter answered him slowly, at first the machinery of conversation stiff from disuse. But the boy listened with his whole body, and that kind of listening draws words out of a person the way warmth draws water from frozen ground. By the 4th week, supper lasted an hour. By the 6th, sometimes 2. And sometimes Cotter would catch himself counting the chairs. There were 5 now. There had been 2 for longer than he wanted to count. And the difference between 2 and 5 was not a number. It was a sound, the sound of a house that had people in it again. There was still the matter of Marin Dunhill and the thing he could not settle about her. Not dishonesty. She was honest. The boys were honest. The work was honest. It was the silence around her past. She had told him she was from Wyoming, that her father had bred horses, that she had been caring for her brothers for 2 years. 2 years of silence lived in those 3 sentences. He did not ask. Not yet. But he noticed that some evenings when the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, Marin would sit at the table and look at the closed door at the end of the hall with an expression that Cotter recognized. The expression of a person who understands that a closed door is never just a door. The first real snow came in the 2nd week of November, silent and heavy, turning the valley into something that looked like a painting of itself. They were sitting after supper. The fire was high because Wynne had built it with his usual architectural seriousness, and the wind was testing the windows. Lark was asleep on the rug, with Bridge curled against his stomach. Anand was at the table with his journal. Wynne was beside him reading a copy of Robinson Crusoe he had found on the shelf in the hallway, a book with a cracked spine and a name written on the inside cover that Cotter had not looked at since the day he placed it there. Cotter saw the book. He saw the name inside it. He said nothing. But Marin, sitting across the table, saw him see it, and she understood. Marin, Cotter said. It was the first time he had used her name. 6 weeks of Ma'am and Miss Dunhill, and the careful, formal distance that a man maintains when he is not yet sure how close he is, willing to let someone stand. But tonight, in the firelight, with the snow falling, and the 5 of them arranged around the room like pieces of a life he had stopped believing in, her name came out as simply and naturally as a breath. She looked at him. What happened in Wyoming? She was quiet for a long time, not deciding whether to lie, but deciding where to begin, because the story has so many beginnings, and each one hurts differently. My father raised horses outside of Sheridan, she said. Quarter horses, mostly. He was good at it. People came from 3 territories to buy from him. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. My mother kept the books and the garden and the house and everything else. She could grow anything. She had a kitchen garden that people talked about in town, like it was something natural, but it was not natural. It was her, every morning, on her knees in the dirt. She paused. She died when Lark was 2. Fever. 3 days from the first. Cough to the end. She said it plainly. The way you say a thing that you have said before, inside your own head, enough times that the words have worn smooth. My father held together for about a year, but he was not a man who knew how to live without her. Some men can learn it. Some cannot. She looked at the fire. He died in January of 1881. The doctor said it was his heart, but I think his heart had been the problem for a year. It just took that long for the rest of him to agree. Cotter said nothing. He understood what she was saying because he had lived inside the same question, whether the heart goes first or last, whether the body carries on because it is strong or because it does not know how to do anything else. He left debts, Marin said. He had borrowed against the land when the herd got sick. The bank took the ranch in March. I sold what I could. Everything. Except this. She touched the farrier's knife on the table. This was his. The firelight caught the blade and held it. And I kept them. She looked at her brothers. My mother's brother, Haddon, was supposed to take us. He came to the ranch before we had finished packing. He looked at the boys the way you look at a bill you do not intend to pay. He told me he would take them, but not me. He said he would put them to work on his place. Something changed in her voice. Tighter. A rope pulled one turn past where it wants to go. Orrin was 11. Wynne was 6. Lark was 3. She looked at Cotter. I looked at Haddon Galt, and I knew. The way you know a horse that has gone wrong, not from anything it does, but from something behind its eyes, a flatness. I knew that if I left those boys with him, something would happen that I could not undo. So I took them. I told Haddon no, and then we left. Where did you go? Cotter asked, though he already knew the shape of the answer. Everywhere. Nowhere long enough to call it anything. 19 months of ranch work and kitchen work and anything anyone would pay me to do as long as the boys could stay with me. Why here? Cotter asked. A woman in Bozeman, Mrs. Cathcart at the boarding house. She told me about you. She said you were a man who had lost something and could not let go of the place where you lost it. She paused. I thought that a man who loved a place that way might understand what it means to hold on to something when the world is telling you to let go. Cotter looked at the closed door at the end of the hall. The room at the end of the hall, he said, his voice lower now. My wife and I built it for a child. We waited 11 years. They are buried on the ridge, both of them. I have not opened that door since. A long silence. The fire spoke. The wind answered. "I know what it costs to keep a door closed," Marin said. "And I know what it costs to open one." Cotter looked at her, and what passed between them was not romance. It was recognition. The plain, unadorned recognition of one person who has survived something, looking at another person who has survived something and understanding, without needing to say it, that survival is not the same thing as living, and that the distance between the two is exactly the width of a door you are afraid to open. "More coffee?" Wynne said from the table, because he was 8 years old and had determined that the adults in the room needed interrupting. And he was right. Cotter almost laughed. He did not. Quite. But the muscles tried, and Marin saw them try. "Yes," Cotter said. "More coffee." They came in December, on a morning when the valley floor was white and the sky was the color of tin, and the cold had a sharpness that meant it intended to stay. Cotter saw them first. 2 riders and a wagon, coming up the Gallatin Road at the pace of people who have business and want you to know it. The wagon was driven by a man in a town coat. Behind him sat a thinner man, with a leather case across his knees. And riding alongside, on a big chestnut that was too much horse for the man on its back, was someone Cotter did not know, but Marin did. She was in the corral working the bay gelding when the riders appeared. Cotter heard the change before he saw it. The horse shifted under her, responding to something in her body that had gone from calm to rigid in the space of a single breath. She was staring at the chestnut rider with an expression he had not seen on her face in 3 months. It was fear, not the surface kind, the deep kind, the kind that lives in the basement of a person's body and comes up the stairs only when the thing it was built to answer walks through the door. "That is Haddon Galt," she said. "And I think the man with the case is from the county." Cotter looked at the house where Orrin was splitting wood and Wynne was carrying water, and Lark was sitting on the step with Bridge telling the dog something important about clouds. "Go inside," Cotter said. "Take the boys. Stay there. Cotter, you do not know what he will say. I do not need to know what he will say. I need him to say it to me." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she dismounted, handed him the reins, and walked to the house. She gathered the boys without panic, without rushing. Orrin resisted. Cotter could see it in the boy's shoulders, but Marin put her hand on his arm and said something Cotter could not hear, and the boy went inside. Cotter walked to the gate. He got there before the wagon did, which was the point. He stood at the fence with his hands visible and his weight balanced, and the stillness of a man who has decided where he stands and is not interested in discussing geography. Haddon Galt was a thick man in a good coat with a beard trimmed in the manner of someone who wants you to know he can afford a barber. He had soft hands, the hands of a man who had money or wanted you to think he did. "I am looking for Marin Dunhill," Galt said without greeting. "I have been informed she is here with 3 minor children who are my legal wards." "Your name," Cotter said. He knew the name. He asked anyway, because asking a man to identify himself is a way of establishing who is asking the questions. "Haddon Galt. Mr. Ferris here is from the Gallatin County Clerk's office. He has a petition for custody transfer." Ferris produced a piece of paper with the careful handling of someone who believes that paper is more powerful than the people it describes. "Mr. Vane, I have a sworn petition alleging that 3 minor children are residing on your property. Without legal guardianship arrangement, Mr. Galt is requesting their return to his custody." "Their sister has been caring for them for nearly 2 years, Cotter said. "Their sister is not their legal guardian. Mr. Galt has the legal standing designated by the deceased father. The deceased father also designated that Mr. Galt would care for all 4 of them. Mr. Galt declined to take the sister. Is that in your petition?" Galt's horse shifted beneath him, and a horse shifts when its rider shifts, and a rider shifts when something has landed that he did not expect. "The sister was of age," Galt said. "She was not my responsibility, but the boys were." And you told a 19-year-old girl to leave her brothers with you and walk away. And when she refused, you let them go, all 4 of them, into nothing. For 2 years. Cotter's voice had not risen. It had dropped. It had gone to the low, quiet register that the horses responded to, and that most men, if they were paying attention, responded to as well. You did not come looking for 19 months. You did not send word, did not send money, did not inquire with a single sheriff's office between Wyoming and Montana whether 3 children were alive or dead. And now you are here with a wagon and a piece of paper, and I am supposed to believe this is about those boys. He looked at Galt. What is in Sheridan, Mr. Galt? What is on that land that their father owned that has become interesting enough to bring you 400 miles in December? The question landed in the cold air and stayed. Galt's face did something complicated, a series of small adjustments that Cotter, who had spent his life reading animals and had learned that the skill transferred perfectly to men, did not miss. This is a legal matter, Galt said. I have rights. You have paper, Cotter said. Those are not the same thing. Failure to comply can result in the involvement of the territorial marshal, Ferris said. Then involve him. And while you are at it, ask him to investigate why a man with legal custody of 3 orphaned children allowed them to spend 19 months homeless. Ask him whether that constitutes abandonment under Montana territorial law. He paused. I have a lawyer in Bozeman. His name is Aldrich Crane. He is a patient man, but not a gentle one, and he will be very interested in this petition. He did not have a lawyer in Bozeman. He had not spoken to a lawyer in his life, but the name came to him from a sign he had seen on a door in town 6 months ago, and he said it with the conviction of a man who has been waiting for this conversation and has prepared for it. Galt looked at the house, where a curtain moved, and the shape of a 13-year-old boy was visible behind it watching. This is not finished, Galt said. No, but it is finished for today. Come back through Mr. Crane, or do not come back at all. Galt turned his horse. Ferris closed his case. They went back down the road, and Cotter watched them go until the sound of the wagon wheels on the frozen ground had faded to nothing. He turned. Marin was standing on the porch. Orrin was beside her, and Wynne and Lark was in the doorway, holding Bridge against his chest with both arms. Marin looked at Cotter. Her eyes were wet, and she was not hiding it. You do not have a lawyer in Bozeman, she said. No, Cotter said, but I intend to have one by Friday. That night, Cotter Vane did something he had not done since February of 1874. He lit the second chimney. He did it after supper, after the boys were in bed. He went to the woodpile and brought in 4 logs of seasoned pine that he had cut 2 years ago, and stacked and never burned. He carried them down the hall. He stood at the closed door for a long time, his hand on the latch. The metal was cold, which should not have surprised him, but did, because in his mind this door was always warm, always alive with the future they had spent 11 years believing was coming. He opened the door. The room was small. A cradle that he had built from cedar stood against the far wall, and next to it a rocking chair that Bessa had brought from her mother's house in Illinois. A yellow blanket with white edging lay folded over the chair's arm, sewn in the autumn of 1873, while she told him names, and he pretended to have opinions about them. Everything was exactly where it had been, the last time this door was open, which was the morning he had carried 2 bodies out of it, and decided that some rooms are not meant to be entered. Again he knelt at the hearth. He laid the fire. The flame took, the chimney drew, and for the first time since that February morning, the second chimney of the Harrow Creek Ranch sent smoke into the night sky. Cotter sat on the floor with his back against the wall and watched the fire build. The cedar cradle threw its shadow on the wall. The yellow blanket caught the light, and the color was the same, exactly the same, as though the years had not touched it. Something released in him that had been held so long and so tightly that the releasing felt less like relief and more like a bone being set necessary and painful and correct. Marin appeared in the doorway. She stood there without entering, present but not pressing, letting the space belong to whoever was in it. "I want to talk to you about something," Cotter said. She waited. "Galt will come back. A man who rides 400 miles in winter for a piece of paper does not give up because someone says a lawyer's name, so we need to make it real." He looked at her. "I went to town today. I found Aldrich Crane's office. He is a real lawyer. I told him everything." He paused. "He says under Montana territorial law, a landowner of good standing can petition for legal guardianship of minor children if the designated guardian has demonstrated abandonment. 19 months constitutes abandonment. It can be won." Marin's hand found the doorframe. He also says it is stronger if the petition comes from more than one adult in the household. Stronger if there is evidence of stability, of permanence. He stood up. The fire was going strong now, and the cradle's shadow on the wall had softened into something gentler than a memory. "I want to offer you a partnership," Cotter said. "Not wages. Not room and board. A stake in this ranch. 30% of the operation. Documented and filed with the county. Your name on the deed, alongside mine." He held up his hand before she could speak. "And I want to file for guardianship of Oren and Wynn and Lark. Jointly, your name and mine. Not because I'm trying to take them from you, because I'm trying to make it so that no one else can." "Why?" she said. Her voice was not steady, and she did not try to make it steady. "You have known us 3 months." Cotter looked at the fire. He looked at the cradle. He looked at the yellow blanket. "Because I built this room for a family," he said. "And I closed it because I lost one. And I have spent every year since pretending that closing this door was the same as accepting what happened, and it was not. It was hiding. And I am tired of hiding." He looked at her. "And because your brother Oren keeps a journal of my land that is more detailed than anything I have ever written about it myself, and because Wynn built a fire this morning that was better than mine, and because Lark named my chickens and I cannot remember what I called them before, and because you saved my best mare with a dead man's knife and a handful of yarrow, and you did not ask for a single thing in return." Marin's eyes were wet. She did not wipe them, and she did not turn away. She stood in the doorway of a room that had been sealed since before some of the people in this house were born, and she let the tears fall, because pretending they were not there would have been dishonest, and she had not been dishonest with him yet. "I will not let you down," she said. "I know," Cotter said. "That is the reason I am standing here asking." From down the hall, a small voice. "Marin, there is smoke coming from the other chimney." It was Lark. Standing in the hallway in his nightshirt with Bridge at his feet, looking at the light coming from the open door with the wide curiosity of a 5-year-old who does not yet know that some doors carry weight. "Yes," Marin said. She bent down and picked him up, settling him on her hip. "There is? Does that mean we are staying?" Marin looked at Cotter. Cotter looked at Lark. "It means you are staying," Cotter said. Lark considered this with the gravity of a small person evaluating a very large idea. Then he looked at Bridge. "We are staying," he told the dog. Bridge wagged his tail, which was the only opinion required. Galt came back in January. He came with a territorial magistrate and a revised petition, and the confidence of a man who has hired better paper and believes better paper wins. He found the Harrow Creek Ranch ready for him. Cotter met them at the gate with Aldrich Crane beside him, a man of 55 with silver hair and a quiet voice and the settled calm of a lawyer who has won enough cases to know that volume is the tool of people who have nothing else. Crane held a leather folio containing 3 documents filed with the Gallatin County Court on the 28th of December, 1882. The first was a legal partnership agreement establishing the Harrow Creek Ranch as a joint operation between Cotter Vane and Marin Dunhill, filed, witnessed, and recorded. The second was a petition for joint legal guardianship of Oren Wynn and Lark Dunhill, supported by affidavits from Dr. Halloran and Bozeman, who had examined all 3 boys and declared them healthy, and from Mrs. Cathcart, who had testified to Marin's character. The third was a counter-petition alleging abandonment of custodial obligation by Haddon Galt, citing 19 months of documented absence. Crane presented these to the magistrate with the unhurried thoroughness of a man laying bricks. The magistrate read them. Galt's lawyer read them. Galt himself watched the paper move between hands with the expression of a man who has walked into a room he expected to be empty and found it furnished. Marin stood on the porch with Orrin beside her. Orrin was wearing new boots, his own boots, purchased in Bozeman with wages from the ranch proper. Work boots that fit his feet and did not require rags in the toes. Wynne was at the well, filling the water buckets, because it was morning and his duties did not stop for visitors. Lark sat on the porch step with Bridge, whose single standing ear was pointed at the visitors with the focused intensity of a dog who has developed opinions about strangers. "Mr. Galt," the magistrate said, "I am going to recommend to the territorial court that this guardianship petition be granted and your counterclaim denied." Galt looked at Cotter. Cotter looked back at him with the unhurried patience of a man standing on his own land, with the law on one side of him and the truth on the other. Galt left. He rode down the Gallatin Road and did not look back and did not come back. And the wagon tracks froze in the yard and were covered by the next snow, and by spring they were gone entirely. The winter that followed was the hardest in 11 years. 3 weeks of cold that cracked the water lines and froze the troughs solid. Cotter and Marin worked through it together, splitting the labor the way a river splits around a stone, each half knowing where the other is going without needing to ask. Anand worked the cattle in cold that would have sent grown men to the fire, and he did not complain, which Cotter noticed without comment because that was how respect moved between them now, quietly, through what was observed and honored without being announced. By the time February broke, something had settled at the Harrow Creek Ranch that had not lived there in a very long time. Not the absence of grief. Cotter still climbed the ridge some mornings and stood at the stone marker and said things that were between him and Bessa alone. That would always be there. Lost does not vacate a house just because new tenants arrive. It simply agrees to occupy a smaller room, and it does so quietly, and it learns the names of the people it now shares the hallway with. But the other things were there. Now the sound of 2 people working in the barn in the morning. The sound of a boy running perimeter, checks with a journal and a purpose. The sound of another boy stacking firewood with the grave precision of someone building a cathedral out of pine. The sound of a 5-year-old explaining the day's agenda to a dog who listened with one good ear and absolute commitment. The sound of supper at 6 and the conversation that went longer now. The sound of a house that had found its footing again on the first warm evening in April. Cotter found Marin sitting on the top rail of the south pasture fence, watching the horses move through the new grass in the late light. He climbed up beside her. His knee reminded him of every year it had carried him, but he managed, and he sat there on the rail with the valley opening up in front of them, gold and green and wide, the mountains still holding their snow on the high peaks against a sky that was so blue it looked like it was trying to prove something. They sat in silence for a while. Below them, Juniper grazed with her foal, a colt born 3 weeks earlier that Lark had named Compass, because he explained the colt always knew which direction to walk. Orrin was in the far pasture, walking the fence line with his journal. Wynne was at the barn, organizing the tack room, because nobody had yet found a way to argue with a 9-year-old whose organizational instincts were better than everyone else's. Lark sat on the barn step with Bridge, conducting what appeared to be a formal interview with a barn cat about its daily schedule. "You wrote to someone," Cotter said. "A woman named Tilda Norick," Marin said. "A friend of my mother's. She kept some things for us when the bank took the house. Letters, photographs, a quilt my mother made." She paused. "I wrote to tell her where we are." She was quiet for a moment. "I have not been able to tell anyone where we are for 19 months because we were never anywhere long enough to be there." Cotter looked at the valley. At the fence line, straight and tight, every post, driven right. At the water troughs, rebuilt and sound. At the second chimney, which had not stopped sending smoke since the night he opened a door he thought would never open. "When Bessa and I came here," he said, "we had a piece of paper and each other and an idea of what this place could be, and there were days when I thought the idea was bigger than what we could build." He paused. "But she used to say something. She used to say that a place does not become a home because you build it. It becomes a home because you choose it. Every morning you choose it again, and the choosing is the thing that makes it real." Marin looked at him. "I stopped choosing," Cotter said. "After she died, I stayed, but I stopped choosing. I worked the land and kept the fences and the roof, but I was not choosing this place. I was enduring it. And there is a distance between choosing and enduring that is exactly the width of an open door." He looked at the house. Both chimneys were sending thin lines of smoke into the evening air, and the kitchen window was lit with the amber glow of a lamp that Wynne would have set on the sill, because it was approaching 6, and Wynne did not tolerate tardiness in matters of routine. "You gave me a reason to choose again," Cotter said. "You and those boys." Marin was quiet. Bridge came around the corner of the barn with Lark behind him, both of them moving with the purposeful urgency of a boy and a dog who have agreed that something across the yard requires immediate investigation. "Lark asked me this morning if he could have a garden," Marin said. "Like our mother had. He does not remember her garden, but Oren told him about it, and now he wants one." She looked at the south-facing slope below the house where the soil was dark, and the morning sun came first. "I told him yes," Cotter nodded. "Bessa had a garden there, first 3 years. She said the drainage was right." "It is," Marin said. I looked. They sat on the fence rail while the sun moved lower and the shadows stretched. From the barn, Oren emerged with his journal under his arm and walked toward the house with the unhurried stride of a young man who knows where he is going and is not in a rush to get there, because the place he is going will still be there when he arrives. Wynne appeared on the porch and raised one hand, which meant supper was ready, which meant it was 6, which meant the world was functioning as it should. Lark's voice carried across the yard, small and clear. "Bridge, we are being called." The dog looked at the boy. The boy looked at the house. Then both of them turned and walked toward it, toward the door that was open, toward the light that was on, toward the sound of someone inside setting the table for 5. Marin climbed down from the fence. She held a hand out to Cotter, which she had never done before, and he took it, which he had not done with anyone since Bessa, and they walked toward the house together, while the last light held on the mountains, and the horses settled in the grass, and the valley did what it had always done, which was hold whatever was placed inside it and ask for nothing in return. A home is not the last stop on a long road. It is not the answer to a question you have been carrying for months or years. It is smaller than that, and it is bigger than that, and it begins the moment you stop looking for it and realize it has been building itself around you, board by board, meal by meal, evening by evening, in the voices of people who have chosen to stay. It begins when a boy names a full compass because the full always knows which way to go. It begins when a 9-year-old sets a lamp in a window because supper is at 6 and the world should know it. It begins when a dog with one good ear wags his tail at the sound of a word he has learned to trust. Some doors close because the people behind them are gone, and some doors open because the people who need them have finally arrived. This one was open now, and it was going to stay that way.